In this video, I'm going to be creating this Stug diorama set on the Eastern Front in the Second World War. I'm James and you're watching LPJ Models. I thought after my last video, the Stug build, the Stug deserved to be put in a diorama. It just came out really nicely, you know? So I thought a nice scene would be the perfect accompaniment to set it off. If you haven't seen the build video, go check it out, the link's in the description. So as well as the tank, I also needed some more details to make the diorama more interesting, so I decided on this Soviet Izba house. It's a nicely detailed file and I printed this on my Saturn IV Ultra at 20 microns with water washable resin. I use Elegoo 8K Space Grey. The file is a nice file from Patrick Miniatures that costs £5, well worth it in my opinion. I did explore other avenues, but they weren't well optimised for 3D printing. I'm also going to need some figures to go with the dio. I bought this STL pack from 3D Emontis. I wanted specifically to torture myself and paint some German camouflage smocks, and these figures really fit the bill. Now they are on the expensive side at €39 for the set, but they were well worth the money. They were originally supposed to be printed in 1/16 scale, but I scaled them down to 1/72. And surprisingly, the details held up really well. Anyway, let's get removing some supports. The first thing I did for this diorama was to clean up the house. I used a mix of a razor saw and a 10A scalpel to chop away those supports. I'm starting to get the knack on how to support things so it doesn't destroy detail. And I made sure that no external surfaces had any supports. So it really didn't take too long to clean up. After I'd removed the supports, I cleaned up any support weaknesses with some high grit sanding sticks. With the supports removed, it was time to make a start on the diorama base. For this I cut some diorama foam to size and stacked it. It's about 1 cm thick per slice, and I stacked up 3, making it 3 cm, and then added a carved section to emulate some raised groundwork. This is where our 3D printed house is going to sit. Something like this. And magically the tank will go around here, and the figures alongside. Obviously without the 3D printed bases. So we've got our base material and rough arrangement, let's lay down the groundwork. First up, I glued the foam pieces together with some wood glue. Any PVA will do, I'm using Gorilla wood glue just because I have it to hand. I placed the dabs evenly around the foam so the glue would distribute evenly when the pieces were stuck together. And once the pieces were stuck together, I used some toothpicks to add some strength. The edges were then given a light sand with a high grit sanding stick. I'm going to build up the groundwork with VMS Smart Mud. This is light and pretty durable. It's also got a nice texture, but I will probably cover the texture over, as I want a slightly different effect. I used an old palette knife from my painting days to help spread the smart mud around. A little bit of water added to the smart mud can also help it spread nicely. When the smart mud had dried, I cut out some balsa strips and stuck these around the edge of the diorama. When the glue had dried, I used a sharp knife to cut the balsa to shape. Just be careful with your fingers when you do something like this. We don't want any accidents. With the edging of the diorama done, I mixed up some mud. Well, a mix of plaster, pigments and VMS diorama textures. And a tiny drop of PVA for extra measure. I added in the water and gave it a good stir. I'm sorry the footage is a bit out of focus here. You'd have thought I'd learnt my lesson by now. My goopy mix was then poured over the entire diorama. I spread it around and brushed it to any nooks and crannies that still needed to be filled, and then I used a piece of balsa wood to smooth it out. Once everything was smoothed out nicely, I sprinkled on some VMS Diorama texture, fine grey earth. I then used a brush to carve in some vehicle track marks. Next up, I added a few different varieties of AK grass tufts. These were glued in place with PVA glue and focused around the house and on the front right corner of the diorama base as a small area of foreground interest. I like using these tufts as you can get a variety of grass layer heights, not something you usually get with normal static grass. With most of the vegetation and groundwork complete, it's time to start painting it. I started with an overall rough brown tone of MRP's RAF Dark Earth. I also used varying shades of Dunkelgelb and lighter dust colours to add some highlights to the groundwork. To add some shading and variety, I used German World War II Dunkelbraun. I painted this around some of the edges and in some of those vehicle wheel tracks. I sprayed some of the tall grasses with an ochre colour and a brighter green for the main grass. I did a few light dust washes over the groundwork and then followed that up with a wash of Abteilung 502 Shadow Brown, which was placed in the sunken vehicle tracks to make them darker and add more contrast. I wanted these to look wet. I'm going to add further wet effects a bit later on. With these oily effects done, this is how far I'm taking the base for the time being, but we will return to it later. So while we're waiting, let's make a start on the house. First up, I primed the interior of the house with VMS No Peel Primer Black. This will make sure when you look through the windows you won't be able to see anything. For the exterior I used the grey VMS No Peel Primer. I wanted a more neutral tone on which to paint on for the outside. I wanted the house to look worn and distressed. I've seen a few really cool looking reference images, and there were a few nice blue ones, so those are what I'm going to base this on. I started by building up some light wood tones, sort of like silvered wood shades. I used a selection of MRP's whites, greys and tans. And these were mottled around the surface, leaving a nice mottled effect. I then used my Ushi van der Rosten splatter template to spray over some grey tones. I then used some Humbrol chipping and scratching agent to spray over the wood areas of the building. I maybe did 2 or 3 light layers to build this up. This was then covered with a patchy layer of white. Just mottled here and there as a base layer for the next colour. For my first blue layer, I mixed up some MRP Oxford Blue, True Blue and White. This will represent the first faded blue colour on the house. I then increased the saturation of the colour and repeated the process again. Then I used some warm water and a stiff tatty brush to chip away the paint to show the worn wood underneath. You can chip lacquers like MRP, like I'm doing here, but it does take a little bit more time for the chipping fluid to activate. Having a broken mottled finish like I do here helps speed up the process. Now and again I needed a bit more abrasive power, so I used a toothpick or a sanding sponge. A similar process was repeated for the white window frames. They were painted with a dark brown wood colour, some chipping fluid was sprayed on, and then some white. Although I'm quite good with my airbrush control, I did still need to mask these windows off. And it was super satisfying to peel off the tape afterwards. This time, to help chip the paint, I upped the ante and used a stiff bottle style brush. To finish the windows off, I used some microscope cover glass and some VMS Transperfix 6K. These pieces of microscope cover glass are extremely thin sheets of glass, and they add to the authenticity by being real glass. If you're careful, you can break them and they will look like broken window panes. But I'm not going to do that here. The sheets of glass were very carefully glued into place. I then started in blocking the colours for the rest of the details on the house. The front flashing was going to be a cool rusty colour. I want to keep it cool so it doesn't contrast too much with the blue of the house. Reference images for the roof tiles varied quite drastically, so I went for a dark black asbestos style roof tile. This was painted black, and then some tans and greys were stippled over the top with a sponge. I used reference pictures to try and match this up as realistically as possible. The roof's looking good, but it needs some more contrast, so I brushed in some dark acrylic colours, just to add some more shadows, dirt and grime. I wasn't sure how I wanted the A-frame of the house to look. In the end, I decided on a worn silvered wood finish. So I used various Vallejo and AK 3rd Gen tans and greys, and carefully painted in some acrylic wood effects. I didn't think the style and size of the grain was too important here, more the colours, so I carefully studied some pictures of worn weathered silvered wood and tried to replicate that as best as possible. The process was fairly long, so I did include a fairly moderate amount of footage to show you how I got from A to B. I started with a middle tan kind of colour and then started painting in some silvery grey streaks. These were followed with some darker layers and some speckles of paint for variation. When the wood grain was done, I added some cooler tones to the rust to try and blend it in a little better. I used pale oranges and some purpley red browns, and used a mix of dry brushing and glazing. Now it's time to start adding the final contrast layers to the house with oil paints. I mainly used AK Shadow Brown, but I also used some Starship Filth. I also used some AK Mossy effects, but I did forget to film that sadly. Several layers of shadow and grime were built up with the oil paints. You can already see the contrast starting to pop on the upper section. The roof also needed some more shadows, so again I got out some shadow brown and mixed it with a touch of black, brushed this on the joins of the roof tiles and then blended it in carefully. When it dries it'll look a little bit more subtle, but the effect will still be there. With the house pretty much done, it was PVA glued onto the base. This little scene is really starting to come together now. I scratch built, yes, scratch built and not 3D printed a small fence and then carefully glued this to the side of the building. I used a few small drops of VMS Flexi 5K CA for PE to fix this into place. Then, to add a bit more life and vegetation, I glued on an AK bush. I'd usually paint these, but I think this looks good as is. For the semi-wet ground, I mixed up some Dulux Materials Aqua Magic with some Vallejo English Uniform, only a tiny touch of the paint to add a tint, and brushed this in any of the sunken areas on the road. Think summer showers on a dry road. I really took my time here to make sure I didn't get any gloss on any areas that I didn't want to be glossy. Makes sense really, but I did have to be careful. So that's the base pretty much complete. Let's have a go at painting the figures. Because I'm an idiot, I decided to paint Plane Tree Camo smocks on my German soldiers. And the paints I'm going to be using are the slightly inaccurate Waffen SS AK 3rd Gen sets. Some of the colours are a bit iffy, so I did have to do a fair amount of mixing. The figures were painted in a tan colour as a base coat. I used MRP pale wood for this. Then the base colours of the smocks were painted in, and then shaded and highlighted. I didn't stray too far from the box colours, but I did have to mix a few to get some correct shades. The first figure I painted out of this set of 5 was my 4th attempt at painting small scale camouflage. I practice especially for these figures. So I'm still learning as I go, so this is more of a what I did than a tutorial. After the shadows and the highlights on the tunic were complete, I started blocking in some of the dark brown splotches of the camo pattern. This took quite a lot of patience and a steady hand, and in some places it took several attempts until I was happy. But using a fine quality sable brush like this Artis Opus 20 Kolinsky sable does help things move along. On top of the brown splotches I painted in the orange splotches. Technical terminology, I know. These were even finer, so I had to be even more careful. For the figures in the summer tunic, instead of a dark brown, the base splotches were a dark green, and there was a bright green for the inner splotches. I really got to stop saying splotches. Once the very tricky camouflage was complete, I painted in the trousers. For these I used AK Field Grey Green shade from the 3rd Gen range. I then used some of the dark browns from the Waffen SS sets to add some shadows to the figures, building these up in light glazes to add more contrast and visual interest to the figures and outline some of the details. The biggest downside I found with these figures is as they were scaled for a larger size, the details also scale with them. So if you make them smaller, the details are much harder to paint, because they're not as pronounced as maybe a specially sculpted 172 figure would be. That aside, I did my best to make sure the details were nice and crisp, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully. The trousers were also shaded and highlighted, as you can see in the footage rolling at the moment. You gotta keep that contrast up, and I'm finding the more I paint smaller scale figures, the more contrast I'm adding. The boots were hit with a dark brown and then given a pale sand wash, just to blend them in a little bit with the base. The guns the figures were holding were painted black and then given a light dry brush of Vallejo's steel from their Model Air range. The skin tones were then highlighted, mainly with a mix of Vallejo's sunny skin tone and pale flesh. I also added in some shadows with some hull red mixed with cork brown. The stocks of the guns were painted with oil paints, a mix of burnt umber, shadow brown and raw sienna. These were brushed on, left to dry for a little bit, and some wood grain was carved in with an old tatty brush. It's now time to bring these diorama elements together. The Stug was glued to the base with some PVA glue. Just a bit to hold it in place. The figures were then removed from their supports and then glued carefully in place with some VMS superglue. With the figures glued in place, all I needed to now do was to paint the edges of the base in black. For this I used some of the black VMS no peel primer. This was then followed by a layer of matte varnish, and the build was pretty much complete. I had some serious technical gremlins making this video, so I'd like to apologise if my voiceover track isn't quite up to my usual scratch. The work, however, I'm really pleased with. I hope you like this diorama. I had great fun building it, although the figures were a little bit tedious. I'd like to give a huge thanks to my Patreons for supporting my work. I appreciate your patience and your support. It is very much appreciated, thank you. And I'd like to thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this little series of a build video and a diorama. It was fun to make, and I do think the end result looks pretty good. But that's not up for me to decide. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to leave a like if you like the video. And hit that subscribe button if you haven't already to see future videos. Anyway, that's all from me. I'm James from LPJ Models. Thanks for watching.